If you didn't already know, colon cancer is on the rise in the US, especially among younger people. It is now the leading cause of cancer death in men under 50 and the second leading cause for women under 50. And the way that most dietitians and doctors are going about addressing it is recommending that you increase your intake of insoluble fiber. While I recommend that this issue definitely needs to be addressed promptly, I do disagree with the way that they're doing it. And so that brings me into the second video of our first series on this channel, The War on Fiber. If you didn't see our first video, which I'm sure most of you did not, I talked about soluble fiber and its role in diabetes and cardiovascular health prevention, and then even gave some of my own counterclaims about how it can be conducive to malnourishment and actually worsen a lot of people's digestive health. So if you haven't already seen that one, I would recommend that you go check it out, but it doesn't need to be in any certain order. I just want you guys to understand what we're really doing with this series, and it's not to tell you that you cannot eat fiber, but is rather to add some skepticism to the mix in this conversation. Because when something is pushed so heavily, my instinct is to get skeptical and to dive deep into it. So that's really what we're doing, and that brings me into this second video, which is going to be about insoluble fiber, but more specifically, I'm going to be talking about carcinogens in food that insoluble fiber has been linked to removing from our digestive systems. There aren't really any other big claims to insoluble fiber because it simply pushes other things out like a broom and is not directly involved in as many complex processes that soluble fiber is. So insoluble fiber is most often found in foods like wheat bran, so grains, in lots of nuts, the skins of fruits and vegetables, and seeds as well. So those are some foods to look out for, whether you are looking to avoid it or include it. So I'm firstly just going to give one of the benefits of insoluble fiber for waste removal. And then the big subject again is going to be carcinogens and how to avoid them. So firstly, just very briefly, I want to talk about insoluble fiber and waste removal. So insoluble fiber is recommended for people that are dealing with constipation to relieve their symptoms. It does make sense that it's being pushed because it is not digested at all by your digestive enzymes, and it also does not dissolve in water. So it simply goes completely undigested, moving through very quickly. And it can add bulk to stool and even bring water from your tissues to the digestive tract to help push it out. And in doing so, it can push other things out as well, which again is why it's pushed not only for relieving constipation, but also for getting rid of these carcinogens. However, a lot of people actually have very strong issues with insoluble fiber. I mentioned in the last video that people do with soluble fiber, and with insoluble fiber as well, it can actually not tear up your intestines, but it can be rough on some people and actually worsen flare-ups of conditions like IBS, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, or diverticulitis. So for those people, I would recommend just completely eliminate both types of fiber from your diet, but especially insoluble fiber. And then also for people that maybe just don't tolerate it as well, like me. And for those people, the good news is there are some great replacements. Citrus fruits have actually been proved to be great for waste removal because of a flavonoid called naringenin, which is a mild laxative. It relaxes your colon and allows things to be pushed out. Another great trick is using lemon water. Lemon water, actually the acidity of it signals to your body to start creating the peristalsis, which are mechanistic contractions that are involved with allowing your body to remove waste. And honestly, I think the best intervention is to go on a low residue diet. And that basically means that you're eating foods that don't have a lot of matter that your body can't digest, so there's not as much waste in the first place. Animal foods are very compatible with our digestive systems, and we're able to extract most of it and use it as fuel rather than waste. So some of those foods are actually great if you want to look for a diet that is actually going to relieve your symptoms from the root. So that's all I want to talk about there, and now I want to get into carcinogens. And just to tell you, my philosophy with disease as a whole is to not add things that may lessen the risk of dangerous compounds that have already been ingested, but rather to remove the dangerous compounds in the first place, if you can. And for many of these cases, I think you'll find that you can absolutely do that. So I'm going to break carcinogens into two groups, mutagens and then other. Starting with mutagens, mutagens are simply compounds that can damage your DNA or alter it and lead to increased rates of mutations at those sites. So they're definitely something that you want to avoid because they do increase cancer risk. So getting into the first mutagens, it's actually going to be a reaction that starts with either nitrates or nitrites. Nitrates are abundantly naturally found in vegetables, like root vegetables or greens especially, but they're also used artificially as preservatives in cured processed meats. And what happens when you ingest nitrates is that they interact with your salivary bacteria to become nitrites. So they're reduced to nitrites. And these nitrites can also be artificially used in these meats in conjunction with the nitrates. But once those nitrites get into your body, they can go through two paths. The first is to become beneficial nitric oxide. Nitric oxide actually relaxes blood vessels and improves blood flow. And that is why many athletes opt for either supplements or things like beet juice that increase their production of it. The other path is that they can become nitrosamines. And nitrosamines are dangerous compounds that have been proven to be carcinogenic. However, they do require interaction with these things called biogenic amines in order to do so. And amines come in three forms: primary, secondary, and tertiary, all of which are most abundantly found in fermented foods or the fermentation, rotting, or breakdown of high protein foods. And that is also why they can be in alcoholic products as well. So when these nitrites interact with these amines, they become these nitrosamines, which are dangerous. Thankfully, vegetables often come with vitamin C and vitamin E, both of which in conjunction can be protective against the formation of nitrosamines and instead encourage nitric oxide production. However, these cured processed meats, which often have multiple types of these amines, plus nitrites and nitrates, don't have any protection against this nitrosamine formation and rather encourage it. So if you're going to take anything away from that, I would suggest that you urgently start cutting out these processed cured meats and assess your risk level when it comes to fermented products or alcohol. Then getting into the next mutagen that I want to talk about is called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And these are actually created through a way that you cook. When you cook meat on a grill, often the fat will drip down into the fire, and this will create a gas that comes up and settles on the meat or any other foods being cooked on the grill beside it. And this coating, these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are once again carcinogenic. There's another thing that has to do with how you cook, and that's called acrylamide. And this is a little bit different. It usually has to do with roasting, baking, or frying starches. And when you do that at very high heat, there can be an interaction between amino acids and the reduction of these sugars that leads to something called the Maillard reaction. And this Maillard reaction causes browning, but also the formation of acrylamide, which is once again dangerous. And finally, there are these environmental toxins like aflatoxin B1, which are often found on vegetables, grains, and nuts because it's formed by a certain mold that can be found on these products if they're contaminated. And this can actually be a potent neurotoxin and a known carcinogen. So that's going to wrap up the mutagens. Now let's talk about just some of the other carcinogens. Starting off with heavy metals, especially cadmium and lead. These are mostly going to be found in soil. And again, products like grains, nuts, or root vegetables are coming into contact with the soil and are at most risk for being contaminated with these heavy metals. And heavy metals are very interesting, and it's something that I've been seeing a lot more of as known or potential carcinogens, and I think it warrants its own video in a different series along the way, but that's definitely something to be cognizant of. And then the last big carcinogen are these things called secondary bile acids, and these are created from primary bile acids that linger in your gut. And I mentioned primary bile acids in the last video, especially for their importance in digesting fats and extracting fat-soluble vitamins. And a lot of people thought that maybe if you're eating more fat, that you're going to have more of these primary bile acids. And it's often cited as a danger because then there's more fuel to turn into these dangerous secondary bile acids. However, that is not true. There are these receptors called farnesoid X receptors that stop that very process. They regulate the amount of these primary bile acids in your gut by detecting how many are already there. So you don't have to be afraid that eating more fats is going to raise the level and therefore raise your risk of secondary bile acid production because it is regulated. However, if you are eating processed foods that not only are high fat but also high sugar, these farnesoid X receptors can actually get dysfunctional. They can be overloaded and therefore lose their ability to detect properly And this is when it becomes an issue. So when working regularly, 95% of these primary bile acids are going to just be recycled from day to day, whereas 5% are excreted to the colon to then be excreted out of your body. And the issue is really when these become these secondary bile acids and move into your colon. You don't want them to linger there, because with colon cancer, these are what create polyps, and polyps are what lead to the cell turnover rate that gets increasingly high, and then that can turn into cancer cell reproduction, which is exactly what you don't want, of course. So insoluble fiber can actually be very beneficial, because while I don't like that it binds to them in the guts and pushes them out because they're regulated there, it can push them out of the colon, and that can definitely be a fix if it's overloaded. Another thing, if you don't want to do insoluble fiber, is dairy has actually been cited, and I've seen more research about it, as being able to bind to them in the colon as well and push them out. So that's definitely something to look into more, and something to maybe add if you fear that you're at risk of having too many of these secondary bile acids. So that's really all I wanted to talk about with cancer. And of course, a lot of this is just your own risk assessment, and I'm just here to present you with the dangers of either certain foods, certain cooking methods, or certain interactions that can happen in your body. But if I'm going to give you any recommendation, it's going to be to absolutely cut out the processed and cured meats, because they have all the fuel to become these carcinogenic compounds. I'll also say with the foods that are high in insoluble fiber, we've seen that a lot of them, like grains, nuts, and root vegetables, can actually have high rates of exposure to these carcinogens. So that's something that I think is worth evaluating as well. However, they do come with a lot of protective compounds that these other processed foods do not, so that does lower their risk a little bit. But as I said, I think for me personally, I would rather just remove the known carcinogens from my diet in any way that I possibly can than add something that's going to reduce the risk. So again, that's up to you. I just wanted to give you everything here so that you could understand it and so that you could make educated choices moving forward. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you learned something from this, because this is a very serious topic. If you haven't seen the last video, I hope that you'll go back and check that one out. I think it's definitely worth watching, and I hope that you'll also check out the other videos in this series as they continue to come out. So thank you everyone, and I hope to see you then.